Lesson 6: Conditional Rendering. Your components will often need to display different things depending on different conditions. In React, you can conditionally render JSX using JavaScript syntax like if statements, and operator, and ternary operator. 1. Introduction. When building user interfaces with React, your components often need to show different content depending on certain conditions. This is what we call conditional rendering. React allows you to conditionally render pieces of the interface using regular JavaScript logic, things like if statements, logical, and operators, and the ternary operator. This means you don't need a special syntax for conditions in React. You simply use JavaScript inside your JSX. 2. Conditionally returning JSX. Imagine you have a component that shows a list of items, for example, a packing list for a trip. Each item can be either packed or not packed. You can use a prop, such as is packed, to represent that state. Now, depending on whether an item is packed, you might want to show a checkmark next to it. You can do this by returning different JSX depending on that condition. If the item is packed, you return one version of the JSX with the checkmark. Otherwise, you return another version without it. This is done by using an if statement that checks whether the item is packed and then returns one of two possible JSX trees. This pattern, checking a condition and returning different results, is one of the most common ways to create conditional rendering in React. 3. Conditionally returning nothing with null. Sometimes you might not want to render anything at all when a condition is true. For instance, if you want to completely hide packed items from your list, your component can return nothing. In React, when you want a component to render nothing, you can make it return null. Returning null tells React, don't render anything here. Although this works fine, it's not very common because it can be confusing for other developers. Instead, most of the time, you'd handle this kind of condition in the parent component, deciding whether to include that component in the JSX or not. 4. Conditionally including JSX. In the previous examples, you returned different JSX structures from inside a component. But sometimes, you only want to include or exclude small parts of JSX, not the whole component. If you notice that both branches of your conditional logic contain a lot of duplicated structure, you can simplify your code by keeping the shared part and conditionally rendering only the small piece that changes. This is where the ternary operator can be very useful. 5. Conditional, ternary, operator, ? and colon. JavaScript includes a very compact syntax for writing simple conditional expressions, the ternary operator. It uses the symbols and colon. You can read it as, if the condition is true, do this, otherwise, do that. For example, if an item is packed, display its name with a check mark, otherwise, just show the name. This is exactly equivalent to using an if statement, but it's shorter and often used inside JSX expressions. This style is great for small, quick conditions. However, if your component becomes cluttered with nested ternary expressions, it can make your code harder to read. In those cases, it's better to split parts of the UI into smaller components for clarity. 6. Logical and operator, $ampersand. Another common and elegant shortcut for conditional rendering is the logical and operator, which uses the $ampersand symbol. You can think of it like this. If the condition is true, then render the element, otherwise, render nothing. This is perfect for situations when you only need to display something in one of the two cases. For example, showing a checkmark only if an item is packed. However, there's a small pitfall. If the left-hand side of the condition is a number and that number is 0, React will actually render the number 0 on the screen. To prevent that, always make sure you use a proper Boolean condition, such as checking whether a number is greater than 0. 7. conditionally assigning JSX to a variable. Sometimes using ternaries or logical operators can make the JSX look crowded. When that happens, it's often better to define a variable that will hold the content you want to display. Here's how that works conceptually. You start by creating a variable, for example, item content, and you set it to the default value, say, the item's name. Then, using an if statement, you change the value of that variable if a condition is met. For instance, if the item is packed, you might assign a version that includes a check mark or even a different element. Finally, you insert that variable into your JSX using curly braces. This approach is slightly more verbose, but it's the most flexible one. It makes it easy to add more logic later and keeps your JSX simple and clean. 8. Why all these styles matter. You've now seen several different ways to handle conditions inside React components. Returning different JSX trees directly with if and return. Returning nothing using null. Using the ternary operator for inline conditional expressions. Using the logical and operator for rendering something only when a condition is true. And using variables to store and later render conditional JSX. Each of these techniques can be useful in different situations. The more you practice, the more natural it becomes to choose the one that best fits your component's logic and complexity. 9. Recap. Let's summarize the key ideas. In React, all conditional logic is handled through JavaScript, not through special syntax. You can return JSX conditionally by using if statements. You can store JSX in a variable and include it later inside curly braces. The ternary operator is a shorthand for simple, if-else, conditions inside JSX. The logical and operator is great for rendering something only when a condition is true. And finally, while these shortcuts are common, you can always fall back on plain if statements if they make your code clearer. 10. Closing thought. Conditional rendering is at the heart of how React components express dynamic behavior. It's what makes your interfaces responsive to data and user interaction. Mastering these different conditional patterns will make your components more expressive, flexible, and easier to maintain.